I need to be honest with you about something that's been sitting on my chest for years. Not in the political sense, God knows politics throws enough weight on all of us, but in the way a quiet detail can crawl into your mind and refuse to leave. I remember a night in the White House when I woke up at 3:17 a.m. I don't know why that number stuck with me, but it did. I walked down the hallway, past the portraits, past the silent offices, and I ended up in the Situation Room. That room always felt colder at night. The lights hummed differently when you're the only one awake. On the table was a briefing folder I hadn't finished earlier. A name was printed halfway down the page, a name I'd seen a dozen times, but for some reason, in that moment, it froze me. Epstein. And right below it, in the same small block of text, another name, Trump. Let me walk you through this, because most people don't understand what that does to a president. You see, the weight isn't in the names themselves. Washington is full of names, some loud, some quiet. The weight comes from the connections your intelligence team subtly circles. Behavioral patterns, travel overlaps, financial shadows. And when two men with that much money, ego, and unchecked access show up in the same intelligence paragraph, you'll learn to pay attention. Most people think the danger of Trump's Epstein-Ties begins with gossip, with rumors from Palm Beach or Manhattan. But the truth is, the stakes were never just social or scandalous. They were national. They were geopolitical. They were about vulnerability, the kind that foreign intelligence agencies dream of exploiting. When you're sitting behind that desk in the Oval, it doesn't matter if you like a guy or dislike him or disagree with him. What matters is whether someone like him can be pressured, manipulated, or compromised in ways that threaten the country. I remember staring at that page and feeling the same sensation I'd felt during a few other moments in my presidency, moments when a sentence suddenly reframed an entire picture. A terrorist cell recruiting in an unexpected region, a financial channel connecting two adversarial states, a virus spreading quietly months before the world noticed. Patterns always reveal themselves before the public sees them. And that page, that one page, felt like a quiet alarm that had been ringing for years. Here's what really scares me, and it's the reason I'm even telling this story now. Most Americans think the Trump-Epstein connection is just tabloid history, a footnote, a headline from a decade ago. But the truth is far uglier, far more consequential. It's one of those things where, once you see the full picture, you can't unsee it. You can't return to the comfortable idea that this was just about two rich men crossing paths. Because it wasn't. It was about access. It was about leverage. It was about a man who would later sit in the Oval Office with vulnerabilities no one fully understood. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine standing in the Oval as you read a briefing that forces you to reconsider something you thought you understood about a man who commands millions of loyal followers. Imagine knowing that public perception and classified reality are two different universes, and realizing that the bridge between them is built on secrets most people will never know. Now imagine that the man in question will one day hold the nuclear codes. That's the moment I had on that cold night. And here's the part that kept me up. I knew that whatever was hiding in the shadows of that Trump-Epstein relationship wasn't going to stay buried forever. Sooner or later, some fracture, some incident, some crisis would drag it out into the open. And if we weren't ready, if the country wasn't ready, the consequences could be catastrophic. This chapter is the beginning of that explanation. Not the full story. Not yet. But the doorway into understanding how powerful men create networks of silence, and how those networks shape the fate of a nation. And the deeper we go, the harder the truths become. When people ask me why I speak so plainly about this topic now, why I don't hedge or soften the edges the way politicians are trained to do, I tell them it's because of the vantage point I once had. And if I'm being honest, it's a vantage point I didn't fully appreciate until long after I left office. There's a difference between hearing about scandals the way the public does and seeing them the way a president sees them. I've sat through the briefings. I've watched intelligence analysts outline risk matrices on whiteboards. I've heard seasoned officers, the kind who've spent decades studying human leverage points, quietly warn, this isn't noise. This is exposure. So when I talk about Trump, Epstein, and the web that connected them, I'm not speaking as a pundit. I'm speaking as someone who's seen how intelligence communities categorize threats long before they reach the headlines. Let me walk you through this. Early in my presidency, during my first stretch of daily briefings, I remember thinking just how much information we never hear about as citizens. My briefers would sit across from me with binders color-coded by region, by threat level, by confidence rating. They'd walk me page by page through a world most people never glimpse, a world where an offhand meeting in Dubai, or a phone call routed through a foreign network, or a flight pattern that doesn't line up with public travel logs can trigger a quiet internal alert. They're not looking for crimes in the traditional sense. They're looking for vulnerabilities, patterns, points of influence, compromise. And that's the part most people miss. The intelligence community isn't obsessed with morality. They're obsessed with risk. They ask, who can be pressured? Who can be influenced? Who has a weakness they can't afford to have exposed? So when a name like Jeffrey Epstein first crosses a folder, it's not because of celebrity gossip or tabloid intrigue. It's because he raised every antenna we have. His wealth didn't make sense. His network didn't match his background. His behavior didn't align with any normal profile of a financier. He was an outlier, and outliers in intelligence work always get a second look. What opened my eyes, though, wasn't seeing Epstein's name. It was seeing the names that consistently appeared next to his. Trump was one of them. Not always front and center. Not always in bold print. But present. Recurrent. Enough to make analysts uncomfortable. Enough to make seasoned professionals exchange those subtle glances that say, there's more here than the public believes. Let me paint you a picture of how these things get analyzed inside the government. An intelligence officer doesn't come in and say, we think there's misconduct here. They come in and say, sir, this individual has repeated contact with a person of interest who demonstrates atypical risk indicators. They talk in coded phrases, atypical, persistent patterns, compromise vectors, words designed to convey seriousness without hysteria. They lay out timelines. They match up guest lists, travel logs, private meetings, financial interactions. They provide context, where the meetings occurred, who else was present, who introduced whom. And always, they pay attention to proximity, the kind of proximity that leaves traces even when participants try to wipe them away. By the time Trump declared he was running for president, these patterns were already known inside certain circles. Not widely, not universally. The U.S. government is massive, and sometimes one hand doesn't know what the other is holding. But among people who tracked influence networks, people who studied how powerful men get leveraged, Trump's name wasn't new. It was familiar. Familiar in the way a name becomes familiar after years of small mentions that create one long, troubling picture. I remember one conversation in particular with a senior intelligence official. He'd worked undercover in 3 different regions, seen enough to understand the ways predators and power brokers operate in the shadows. He told me, the problem isn't that these men think they're invincible. The problem is that they don't even realize when they've already been compromised. He didn't say Trump's name. He didn't have to. It was understood. And it wasn't personal. It wasn't political. It was professional. These people analyze vulnerabilities the same way a doctor analyzes symptoms. Clinical. Detached. Urgent when necessary. Here's what really scares me. The lead-up to Epstein's downfall revealed a truth about American power that most citizens still haven't grasped. Epstein wasn't just a criminal. He was a node, a connector point, a network of influence stretching from Wall Street to Washington to foreign capitals most Americans can't find on a map. And Trump wasn't just someone who happened to know him. Their worlds overlapped in ways that intelligence analysts flagged long before the public had any clue something was wrong. Most people assume proximity is harmless. So what if they were in the same place? So what if they ran in the same circles? But intelligence doesn't work on so what? Intelligence works on patterns. If 2 powerful men share repeated private access, share friends with histories of exploitation, share interests that foreign intelligence services monitor, and share a social world where young women are treated as currency, you examine that. You don't dismiss it as coincidence. You ask yourself, what does this connection say about risk? About leverage? About what might already be known by someone we can't see? That's why my perspective is different. When the public saw a rich guy posing at parties in the 90s, I saw risk indicators. When the public heard Trump say, I've known Jeff for 15 years, I heard an intelligence echo, the kind that tells you the story runs deeper than the sanitized version offered to cameras. When the public dismissed Epstein as a lone monster, I saw what happens when systems fail to protect the vulnerable and instead shield the powerful. And that's why I'm speaking now. Not because I want to rehash old scandals. Not because I'm interested in moralizing. But because the Trump-Epstein connection didn't disappear when Epstein died. It didn't dissolve with legal settlements or redacted testimonies. It remains a window into how influence, exploitation, and power intersect in ways that threaten the stability of a democracy. By the time I walk you into the next chapter, into the moment I first saw Epstein's name linked directly with Trump in a way that made my stomach drop, you'll see what I mean. You'll understand why this story isn't about gossip or politics or grudges. It's about the architecture of compromise. I can tell you the exact moment Epstein's world truly entered mine, because it didn't feel like a normal briefing. It felt like someone had quietly nudged open a door I didn't even realize existed. And once I looked inside, I couldn't unsee what was there. This wasn't some dramatic confrontation or sudden revelation. It was a Tuesday. It was raining. And I was tired, the kind of tired that sinks into your bones after weeks of back-to-back crises. But intelligence work doesn't wait for convenient timing. It walks in when it wants to. It whispers when everyone else is shouting. Let me walk you through how that day unfolded. I remember sitting down at the long wooden table in the Oval, a mug of tea cooling faster than I could drink it. My briefer, a quiet, meticulous analyst who rarely showed emotion, slid a thin folder across the table. Not the thick binders packed with geopolitical hotspots or cyber attack data. This one was slim, unassuming. The kind of folder that usually holds personal background notes or updates on ongoing investigations. She tapped the top corner with her pen. No words, just that tap. When someone with her experience taps a file instead of speaking, you learn to pay attention. I opened it and scanned the page. The name Jeffrey Epstein wasn't bolded, but it might as well have been stamped in red ink. Beneath it were several bullet points, each representing a piece of information collected over years. Flight patterns, contact logs, social connections, financial relationships that didn't match the public narrative. I'd seen his name before, brief mentions, small flags, but this time something stood out. A notation that simply read, repeated private interactions with, redacted, connections consistent with grooming environments. And then on the next page, the redaction wasn't there. Trump, not as a headline, not as an accusation, just as a data point that had now appeared too many times to ignore. I looked up at my briefer. She was watching me, waiting for the moment I understood what she already knew. Sir, she said softly, we've been seeing an increasing number of cross-references. Nothing actionable yet, but consistent. And clustered. In intelligence language, that's a word that carries weight. It means the data isn't random anymore. It's forming a shape. Let me paint you a picture of what was in that file. These weren't salacious details or sensational accusations. These were patterns, the kind intelligence agencies map because patterns predict risk. Notes about how often Trump's name appeared next to Epstein's during the 1990s and early 2000s. Notes about social gatherings where recruitment of underage girls was later confirmed by multiple victims. Notes about interactions that took place in locations law enforcement had flagged for unexplained activity. None of it proved wrongdoing on Trump's part. But the proximity, the repeated, unbroken proximity, suggested a relationship deeper than public perception allowed. As I turned the pages, a particular entry caught my eye. A brief witness statement from years prior. It described a situation, vague and complete, where Trump and Epstein were reportedly seen together in an environment later identified as part of Epstein's grooming network. The statement wasn't strong enough for prosecution. It wasn't verified. But intelligence does not require courtroom certainty to raise alarms. They evaluate risk, not guilt. I remember feeling a cold tightening in my chest. Not because of what it explicitly said, but because of what it implied. If even a fraction of those entries were accurate, it meant Trump had walked into an environment capable of generating compromat without ever realizing it. And compromat doesn't require crime. It requires vulnerability. I closed the file. How long has this been developing? I asked. My briefer paused. Longer than most people realize, sir. And that sentence, that quiet, unadorned sentence, was the beginning of everything that followed for me. I'd always known Trump and Epstein were socially connected. Anyone paying attention to New York's elite circles knew that. But what I hadn't understood, what I hadn't seen laid out with analytical precision, was how intertwined the timelines were, how often they appeared in overlapping environments, how many witnesses described them in the same rooms, the same houses, the same private events, how consistently Trump surfaced in Epstein's orbit before the public even knew what Epstein was. This wasn't a political adversary's file. This wasn't opposition research. This was intelligence analysis. Clinical, detached, and deeply troubling. Let me paint you another picture. After the briefing ended, I sat alone in the Oval for a long time. Rain was beating against the windows. The room felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were processing what I had just read. I thought about how much of the presidency involves managing risk, not just global threats, but the personal vulnerabilities of powerful Americans whose actions can ripple outward in ways no one anticipates. I thought about every briefing I'd received on foreign intelligence services and how they operate, who they target, how they gather leverage, the kind of environments they monitor. And I thought about Trump, a man who would later sit behind the same desk where I was sitting, a man with an orbit filled with people who already showed up in intelligence reports. Here's what really scared me. As I replayed the timelines in my mind, it became clear that the connection between Trump and Epstein wasn't incidental. It wasn't an isolated anecdote. It was recurring, persistent, and deeply relevant to national security because Trump wasn't just another wealthy man. He was a public figure with political aspirations and a vulnerability profile that foreign governments would study the way a surgeon studies an X-ray. That was the moment, that exact moment, when I realized we were dealing with something far more dangerous than the public narrative ever acknowledged. Not because Trump had committed a proven crime alongside Epstein, but because the nature of their proximity created a kind of shadow risk the American people were never told about. When I stood up from my chair, the folder still open on the desk, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. This story didn't end with two men photographed at parties. It didn't end with Epstein's arrest. It didn't end with his death. It was part of a darker pattern involving power, access, and exploitation, a pattern that would later shape decisions made from the highest office in the land. Most Americans remember the early 2000s version of this story, the shiny, tabloid polished surface. Trump and Epstein photographed at parties. Trump giving one of his offhand remarks about Epstein liking beautiful women as much as I do. The kind of quote that gets recycled on late-night shows but never treated as anything deeper than a rich man's bravado. And for years, that was the public version. Two wealthy New York figures drifting in and out of the same social orbit. But the truth is, the public saw a shadow on the wall while the real shape was moving quietly behind it. Let me walk you through the difference between the public story and the real one. Not the one built on rumor, but the one laid out in case notes, sealed filings, and quiet conversations in side rooms where cell phones aren't allowed. When I first entered office, I understood that some scandals existed in two layers, the surface narrative and the classified context. Take any major corruption case you've heard of in the last 30 years. I guarantee the classified version reads differently. Cleaner in some places, uglier in others, but always more revealing. Epstein was no different. The public saw an eccentric billionaire with a mysterious island. Intelligence saw a man whose wealth had no clear origin, whose private planes were monitored for unusual travel patterns, and whose network included individuals already known for compromising behavior in foreign jurisdictions. Let me paint you a picture of how federal investigators looked at Epstein during those early 2000s years. I remember a closed-door conversation with a Justice Department veteran, someone who'd survived the worst of the mafia wars, the cartel crackdowns, the wave of financial corruption cases in the late 90s. He told me, "We didn't track Epstein because of who he was. We tracked him because of who kept showing up around him." That sentence has stayed with me ever since. According to investigators, what stood out wasn't a single incident, but a pattern. Powerful men arriving at Epstein's properties without explanation, young women being cycled in and out at hours that made no sense, private gatherings where the guest lists were far more telling than the headlines that followed. And right there, threaded through those notes, Trump's name appeared again. Not constantly, but consistently. Enough that investigators began to see him not as an incidental acquaintance, but as part of Epstein's broader ecosystem. This is where the public story diverges sharply from the real one. In the public story, Trump distanced himself early, claimed he was not a fan, suggested he barely knew Epstein beyond superficial social overlap. But investigators I spoke with over the years described something different, a relationship that was deeper before it fractured. One agent, who'd reviewed some of Epstein's early case material, told me they move in the same world. They weren't strangers passing in the night. He went further, explaining how those social circles weren't just playgrounds for the wealthy. They were recruitment pools, leverage markets, places where boundaries blurred and exploitation flourished. And here's the part the public rarely grasped. The 2002 to 2005 period wasn't just about Epstein's behavior. It was about how the system around him responded, or more accurately, didn't. Local jurisdictions hesitated. Prosecutors backed off. Witnesses felt pressure. Evidence was sealed, minimized, or quietly redirected. The public was told it was a complex case. Intelligence saw something else, influence at work. Not necessarily from Trump alone, but from a broader constellation of powerful men who benefited from silence. Let me explain something in simple terms. When the Department of Justice gets close to charging someone whose connections reach into elite political or financial networks, there are two reactions: official caution and unofficial pressure. Files move slower. Decisions get reconsidered. Terms like insufficient evidence appear where stronger language once stood. And while no one ever says out loud, "Protect this person," the effect is the same. Accountability dissolves. That's exactly what happened to Epstein during that era. And here's what really scared me when I first learned those details. Trump's name kept resurfacing not because investigators targeted him, but because he was already part of the environment investigators were studying. His comments, those flippant public remarks about young girls, about knowing Epstein very well, weren't read as jokes. They were read as indicators. Behavioral cues. Signs that Trump felt comfortable enough with Epstein's world to joke about it openly. In intelligence work, comfort often means proximity. Proximity means exposure. Exposure means vulnerability. By the time I finished reviewing the differences between the public story and the real one, I realized something I wish more Americans understood. The Trump-Epstein connection wasn't a footnote. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a signal, a warning, that a future president had moved through circles where exploitation wasn't an accident. It was an expectation. And once you understand that, the next chapter, where the pattern begins in the 1990s, takes on an entirely different meaning. If you really want to understand how deep the Trump-Epstein connection goes, you have to go back further than most people ever look. Not to the headlines of the 2000s, not even to the early 2000s police investigations, but to the 1990s. Palm Beach, Manhattan, Mar-a-Lago. The decade when wealth behaved like a sovereign state, and men like Trump and Epstein rule their own private empires with almost no scrutiny at all. Let me walk you through that world, because once you see what the 1990s actually looked like behind the closed doors of the elite, the rest of the story stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like inevitability. I remember a conversation I had with a retired Justice Department investigator, someone who'd worked organized crime, public corruption, and trafficking cases back when all of this was just smoke, long before the fire became visible. He told me, if you want to understand Epstein, you have to understand the ecosystem he built. And if you want to understand the ecosystem, you have to look at the men who thrived in it. Trump was one of those men. Not because he shared Epstein's specific crimes, but because he shared Epstein's world, a world of indulgence, entitlement, and access without boundaries. Let me paint you a picture of Palm Beach in the mid-90s. Imagine a place where money insulated you from consequence, where private parties blurred the line between the legal and the grotesque, where powerful men traded girls the way they traded business deals. A place where people with too much money and too few limits felt safe enough to indulge their darkest impulses. It wasn't a secret. It was simply understood. And it was in that environment of unchecked privilege, where Trump and Epstein's relationship deepened. Remember, this was before Epstein was a household name, before the Lolita Express, before the island became infamous. Back then, he was simply a wealthy man whose money didn't make sense, and whose social circle was beginning to feature younger and younger women. And Trump? He was rising, in business, in fame, in ego. And he gravitated toward people who made him feel powerful. Epstein was one of them. Here's what people forget. Epstein didn't build his network alone. He built it by embedding himself in social spaces where young girls were accessible and wealthy men were eager for entertainment. One of those places was Mar-a-Lago. And the recruitment pipeline, the one victims later described in painful detail, didn't begin with a single house in Manhattan or a single island in the Caribbean. It began with parties, gatherings, Events hosted by men who believed the rules didn't apply to them. I spoke once with someone who had been involved in the early civil litigation against Epstein, someone who'd interviewed multiple victims. She told me, there were always other men around. Some were names we recognized. Some weren't. But Trump's name came up more than most people realize. Not as an abuser in those early accounts, but as a man who was present. As a man whose spaces overlapped with Epstein's operations. As a man whose social environment made Epstein's crimes easier to commit. Think about that. Presence. Not guilt. Presence. Presence is the connective tissue in exploitation networks. Who was there? Who facilitated access? Who opened the doors, knowingly or not? And when you map those patterns, Trump isn't on the fringe. He sits exactly where you'd expect a major figure in Epstein's orbit to sit. Let me give you an example that rarely gets discussed but sits buried in old case notes. In the mid-90s, a former Mar-a-Lago staffer noticed unusual interactions between Maxwell, Epstein, and young women who were hired for seasonal work. One of those women later became one of the earliest known victims. And according to multiple witness accounts, Maxwell and Epstein didn't simply stumble onto Mar-a-Lago. They were invited, welcomed, within Trump's orbit, within his world. That early connection, that shared environment, is what intelligence professionals look at decades later when they assess risk. Because environments create opportunities. Opportunities create exposure. And exposure creates vulnerability. You have to understand something. Men like Epstein don't operate in isolation. They need enablers. They need glamour. They need social legitimacy. And in the 1990s, Trump gave Epstein exactly that. Not consciously, not as part of a conspiracy, but as a consequence of his lifestyle. His clubs, his parties, his hunger for attention. Epstein exploited powerful men's egos the way a fisherman exploits currents. Let me paint you a more personal picture. A few years after I left office, I met privately with a former federal agent who had reviewed early Epstein case files, the ones most people don't even know exist. He told me something that stuck with me. It wasn't that Trump knew everything. It's that he didn't know how much he didn't know about the rooms he allowed into his life. That's what made Trump a risk. Not that he was Epstein's partner, but that he was Epstein's proximity. And proximity is everything. Here's what really scares me when I think back on those interviews, those case notes, those briefings. The 1990s weren't just the origin of the Trump-Epstein story. They were the blueprint. They showed how easily powerful men could be drawn into a web they didn't fully understand. They showed how silent bystanders become part of the infrastructure that predators rely on. And they showed how vulnerabilities, small at first, grow into national security liabilities decades later. Because when the 1990s ended, one thing didn't, the record. The timelines. The overlaps. The patterns. And as I reviewed them years later from the Oval Office, with intelligence analysts connecting that most Americans never even glimpsed, I realized something that made my stomach turn. Trump wasn't just someone who knew Epstein. He was someone who existed inside Epstein's ecosystem during the years when that ecosystem was most active, most predatory, and most protected. And once you understand that, once you see the origins of the pattern, the incident that changed everything, the one I'll tell you about next, becomes impossible to ignore. There's always one moment, one scene, one conversation, one document that forces everything you thought you understood to shift. Most people imagine these moments as dramatic, like something out of a political thriller. But in reality, they usually arrive quietly, subtle, almost ordinary. And that's what makes them so unsettling. Because when something world-shaping enters your life without a bang, you realize it had probably been moving toward you for far longer than you knew. Let me walk you through the moment that changed everything for me. The moment I realized Trump's ties to Epstein were not just historical footnotes, not just uncomfortable associations, but indicators of something far more dangerous. It happened during my presidency, but the information itself came from a much earlier period, buried in old interview notes, overlooked witness statements, and partial case summaries that had been passed around between agencies over the years like radioactive material nobody wanted to touch. I remember sitting in a secure room at the White House, SCAF as we call it, reviewing intelligence updates with a small team. SIFs feel like submarines, windowless, air thick with recycled oxygen, fluorescent lights that buzz just softly enough to make you uneasy. One of my analysts, a veteran with a background in tracking trafficking networks, slid a document across the table with 2 fingers. Not a full report. Just a single-page copy from an old file. "Sir," she said quietly, "you'll want to read this one." The document summarized a witness account from the late 1990s, years before Epstein was ever prosecuted. The witness was young at the time, barely past adolescence. Her statement wasn't polished, and it was clear English wasn't her first language. But the details were precise in a way survivors rarely are unless they're telling the truth. She described being brought to a residence for what she thought would be modeling-related work. She described Epstein. She described Maxwell. And then she described other men who sometimes came through. Men who weren't always there, but whose presence shifted the atmosphere instantly. The investigator's notes summarized it like this. Witness identifies 2 prominent individuals at the residence on at least one occasion. One positively identified as Epstein. One described as the man from television. Attached to the document was a photo spread used during the interview. One of the photos was Trump. Let me be clear, the witness did not accuse Trump of assault. She did not say he touched her. What she said was more subtle, and in some ways more chilling. She said the second man spoke with Epstein privately, laughed with him, and watched the girls before leaving abruptly. Her description matched Trump's physicality, demeanor, and heartbreakingly, the awkward way he reportedly tried to dress younger girls with compliments. Was this testimony enough to prove wrongdoing? No. Was it enough to prosecute him? Not remotely. But was it enough to raise every alarm inside the intelligence world? Absolutely. Because intelligence isn't about waiting for a crime scene. It's about identifying vulnerability. Let me paint you a picture of how intelligence officers react to something like this. They lean forward. They underline phrases. They exchange glances that communicate a dozen unspoken thoughts. They ask questions like, was this an isolated witness or part of a pattern? Were there other similar accounts? Are these environments consistent with grooming pipelines? Who else was present? What leverage does this create? This is the world I lived in. These are the questions I had to ask. What struck me most wasn't the possibility that Trump participated in Epstein's crimes. It was the possibility that Trump had been present in moments where crimes occurred around him. That distinction matters more than most people realize. In intelligence terms, presence is enough to create vulnerability. Presence is enough to compromise a powerful man without him ever knowing he's compromised. After reviewing the document, I remember leaning back in my chair, feeling the kind of cold that isn't about temperature, it's about realization. A realization that a man who would later become the leader of the free world had walked into a situation that could be used against him. By whom? By anyone who had the evidence. Epstein himself. Maxwell. Foreign intelligence services. Other powerful men with their own agendas. Whoever got to the information first. Here's what really scared me. When we cross-referenced this witness account with other early case materials, with flight logs, with visitor notes, with staff interviews, the timelines matched. The locations lined up. The private gatherings overlapped with places Trump was documented to have been. Not constantly, but enough. Enough to recognize the beginnings of a pattern. And that's when it hit me, Trump didn't need to be a co-conspirator to pose a risk. He only needed to be a man who had stepped into the wrong room at the wrong time. A man whose pride would never allow him to admit vulnerability. A man whose power would make him an irresistible target for leverage. By the time I walked out of that safe and back into the daylight, I understood something that has haunted me ever since. This wasn't just a story about Epstein. It wasn't even a story about Trump being near Epstein. It was about the fragility of American security when a future president carried secrets he didn't even know he was carrying. And the fallout from that moment, the next part of the story, would reveal even more than I expected. If there was ever a moment when the Trump-Epstein dynamic surfaced into public awareness, even faintly, it was the so-called ban story. You've probably heard fragments of it over the years. Trump allegedly banning Epstein from Mar-a-Lago after some kind of incident involving a young girl. In the public imagination, that story became a kind of exonerating badge evidence, supposedly, that Trump cut ties and stood on the right side of a morally reprehensible situation. But inside intelligence and law enforcement circles, that incident raised far more suspicions than it settled. Let me walk you through why. The first time I heard the full version wasn't from a reporter or a politician. It was from a former Palm Beach detective who met with my team years after Epstein's initial arrest. This was a man who'd spent decades dealing with predators, traffickers, and wealthy offenders who used influence to steer consequences away from themselves. He told us, when a man like Epstein gets banned from a place like Mar-a-Lago, it's not because someone suddenly found a conscience. It's because power collided with power. That line stuck with me. Let me paint you a picture of what investigators pieced together. According to multiple early reports, some formal, some buried in internal notes, there was an incident at Mar-a-Lago involving Epstein and a girl who worked there. Accounts differ on the specifics, but what's consistent is that Epstein behaved in a way that crossed a boundary even Trump recognized as dangerous. And that's the part most people overlook. The danger wasn't moral. It was territorial. Men like Trump and Epstein treated social spaces like kingdoms. And in kingdoms, access is currency. Influence is border control. When Epstein crossed a line inside Trump's domain, the response wasn't outrage. It was turf protection. But here's where the deeper concern begins. In law enforcement culture, a ban often signals the opposite of what people think. It doesn't erase a relationship, it acknowledges one. You only ban people who were close enough to enter in the first place. And when intelligence analysts see a sudden rupture between two powerful men, they ask a specific question. What caused the rupture? Was it guilt? Was it fear? Was it competition over the same recruitment pipeline? Was it the result of someone attempting to control, leverage the other possessed? Because in networks like Epstein's, conflict isn't a moral firewall, it's a warning flare. I remember reviewing an internal note written by a federal investigator who had studied Epstein's early years. It said, the falling out between Epstein and Trump may indicate overlapping interests, not a clean separation. Let that sink in. Not a clean separation. An overlap. An entanglement. A collision inside an ecosystem that investigators were already mapping as predatory. Let me explain this the way one intelligence officer did for me. When predators operate in overlapping environments, they don't break ties over morality. They break ties over access. That sentence reveals far more than the sanitized public narrative ever did. Think back to the timeline. Trump was photographed with Epstein multiple times. He spoke warmly about him. He described Epstein's behavior toward young girls in ways that sounded more like admiration than alarm. Epstein attended Trump's parties. Trump attended Epstein's. Their social circles merged repeatedly. And then suddenly, Trump bans him. Not years before the grooming accusations surfaced. Not after an emotional confrontation. But after a specific incident involving a girl. Here's what really scares me. When investigators dug into that time frame, they discovered multiple reports of Epstein recruiting young women directly from environments like Mar-a-Lago. The club wasn't just a luxury compound. It was fertile ground, a place filled with staff and seasonal hires, many of them young, many financially vulnerable, many isolated from family. Maxwell herself was identified in later testimonies as recruiting girls from those very circles. And yet Trump never raised alarms publicly. Never issued warnings to staff. Never reported Epstein. Never protected the girls who worked inside his own walls. He issued a ban. A ban that served more as a symbolic severing than an act of courage. A gesture likely motivated by conflict, not conscience. Let me paint one last picture for you, because it's the image that kept coming back to me as we review the data. Imagine two men standing on the edge of a line neither of them should ever have approached. They're not allies. They're not enemies. They're orbiters, circling the same gravitational pull of wealth, ego, and access. One crosses a boundary, and the other reacts not with morality, but with ownership. That's not distance. That's divergence. A split born from the same foundation, not a break from it. And once you understand that, you begin to see why investigators, and frankly, why I never saw the Mar-a-Lago ban as a protective act. We saw it as evidence of an earlier closeness. We saw it as a symptom of a fractured alignment between two powerful men who had once been far closer than the public realized. It was the moment that hinted at a deeper, more dangerous pattern, a pattern that would reveal itself fully in 2008 when the system itself tried to warn us and we ignored it. The 2008 Epstein plea deal is one of those moments in American legal history where, if you slow it down and study it frame by frame, you begin to understand just how deeply the powerful can bend reality to protect themselves. Most people remember the headlines, the sweetheart deal, the slap on the wrist, the quiet negotiations behind closed doors. But what most Americans never saw is how that plea deal sent shockwaves through federal agencies and intelligence channels. Not because Epstein escaped accountability, but because the scope of what didn't get investigated was staggering. Let me walk you through the part of this story the public never learned, part that convinced many of us inside government that the Trump-Epstein connection was not something we could ignore. I remember the first time I reviewed the internal analysis of that plea deal. This wasn't a public briefing. This wasn't a newspaper op-ed. This was a classified overview circulated among senior law enforcement and intelligence officials, a document outlining the risks left unaddressed by the 2008 decision. It was clinical, unemotional, almost sterile in tone. But if you read between the lines, you could see the alarm bells ringing. The first red flag was the structure of the plea deal itself. Epstein pled guilty to a single minor state charge, not federal sex trafficking, not solicitation of minors across state lines, not conspiracy. Just a single charge that carried barely more than symbolic consequences. And the terms around it were even more troubling. Work release privileges, sealed agreements, immunity extensions for unnamed co-conspirators. That phrase, unnamed co-conspirators, haunted investigators for years. Because in law enforcement, immunity isn't given lightly. It's given to people who might otherwise be drawn into the center of the storm. Let me paint you a picture of how federal agents reacted. These were career professionals who tracked trafficking networks, corruption rings, and elite criminal behavior for decades. And when the plea deal came down, many of them sat in stunned disbelief. One agent told me, "I've never seen anything like it." It was as if someone walked into the room and unplugged the entire system. Another said, "We had evidence. We had witnesses. We had momentum." And suddenly, all we had was silence. And here's where Trump re-enters the picture. The public version of that plea deal says nothing about him. No mention in court filings. No mention in public statements. No questions from prosecutors. Nothing. But inside internal memos, the kind that never make it to public view, investigators flagged Trump as one of the individuals whose relationship with Epstein warranted further examination. Not because of crimes proven, but because of proximity, patterns, and the kind of early reports you saw in Chapter 6. When the plea deal shut everything down, those investigative leads were frozen in place. Not disproven. Not dismissed. Just abandoned. One of the analysts assigned to review the fallout told me something that still bothers me. She said, "We weren't allowed to follow the lines. Not the ones that led to Maxwell. Not the ones that led to the social circles. Not the ones that led to the men who were always around Epstein in those years." Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "especially not the ones involving influencers with political potential." That phrase, political potential, should worry every American. Donald Trump wasn't president in 2008. He wasn't even running. But he was rising in visibility. His brand was expanding. He had a public profile that made certain prosecutors hesitant to pick a fight. And whether consciously or not, the plea deal insulated him from scrutiny. A scrutiny that might have revealed far more about the environments he shared with Epstein during those critical years. Let me explain something clearly. The intelligence community doesn't care about partisan politics. They care about leverage. They care about vulnerabilities. They care about who might be compromised, intentionally or not. And when Epstein avoided federal prosecution, when court documents were sealed, when names were protected by immunity deals, the analysts saw something terrifying, an unfinished web. A network left half exposed. A list of wealthy, powerful men, some famous, some obscure, who were shielded by a plea deal that made no rational sense. One senior DOJ official put it to me bluntly, "We had a live wire in our hands, and the plea deal wrapped it in insulation." And here's what really scared me when I reviewed those materials years later. The plea deal didn't merely protect Epstein. It protected every man who intersected with his operation. It protected the networks, the friendships, the secrets, the exposures. It ensured that the witness accounts, the ones from the 90s, the ones connecting various high-profile individuals to Epstein's environment, remained in sealed boxes instead of open courtrooms. Trump benefited from that insulation. Not necessarily because he demanded it. Not because he orchestrated it. But because the system that failed the victims also failed to examine the full truth of his relationship with Epstein. And for intelligence professionals, that incomplete picture is far more dangerous than a completed one. Because it leaves open questions. It leaves shadowy gaps. It leaves unknowns, and in national security, unknowns are where crisis grows. Let me paint you one more picture before we move to the next chapter. Imagine sitting in a secure room with a pile of documents that outline one of the most disturbing criminal networks in modern American history. Imagine flipping through pages of redacted witness statements, redacted flight logs, redacted financial trails, and realizing that the redactions aren't hiding irrelevant details. They're hiding entire subplots, entire relationships, entire patterns that were never followed because the 2008 plea deal slammed the door on further investigation. And imagine recognizing that one of the men behind those redactions, one of the names protected by omission, sidestepped by prosecutors, shielded by silence, would one day sit behind a resolute desk. The plea deal wasn't the end of the story. It was the warning. And by the time Epstein resurfaced in 2019, that warning became undeniable and far more dangerous than anyone expected. When people hear the phrase intelligence flags, they picture dramatic scenes, red lights flashing in a control room, agents rushing across a sleek command center, someone shouting, "We've got a problem." But in truth, intelligence flags are quieter, subtle. They sit at the edges of reports, tucked into footnotes, hidden in cross-reference tables that only a few people ever read closely. And yet, those small markings often reveal more about a person than any headline ever will. Let me walk you through what intelligence agencies actually saw when the names Trump and Epstein kept appearing together. Not in scandal pieces, not in gossip columns, but in the raw, unfiltered data that analysts examine every day. When I took office, one of the first lessons I learned was this: intelligence isn't about proving guilt. It's about identifying risk. Who can be pressured? Who can be compromised? Who has vulnerabilities that adversaries might exploit? The intelligence world doesn't wait for crimes to go to court. It reads behavior the way a doctor reads symptoms. Trump, long before he entered politics, was already the kind of figure intelligence agencies quietly tracked. Not because he was destined for office, but because he fit a profile: wealthy, impulsive, surrounded by people who trafficked in access, and connected to foreign partners whose interests did not always align with ours. Most of those flags were mild on their own. A curious financial relationship here. A questionable business partner there. But when Epstein entered the frame, the shape of the data changed. Let me paint you a picture of the kind of flag we're talking about. Imagine an analyst sitting in a dimly lit room, reviewing call logs, travel histories, and financial patterns. They notice a name popping up alongside Jeffrey Epstein's in ways that don't match public explanations. Maybe it's 2 visits to the same residence in the same week. Maybe it's overlapping guests on a private flight manifest. Maybe it's one of those quiet notations from an earlier agency report that says, "Individual A observed in company of J. Epstein during flagged event." Now imagine that individual is Trump. In isolation, none of those details prove wrongdoing. But intelligence doesn't look at isolation. It looks at patterns. And the Trump-Epstein pattern raised eyebrows. One analyst told me, Epstein was always on our radar, but we didn't fully understand his role. Then we started noticing the same names surfacing around him repeatedly. Trump's was one of them, not front and center, not the main figure, but present often enough that analysts began paying attention. And here's the critical part: they didn't just track Epstein because of crimes. They tracked Epstein because of compromise potential. Foreign intelligence agencies, Russia, China, Israel, even some European services, study men like Epstein with forensic precision. Why? Because they are gateways. They collect secrets without meaning to. They host people who think they're invincible. They create environments where men lower their guard, sometimes in ways that generate leverage that can be weaponized decades later. Let me be blunt. Epstein was viewed globally as someone who might have been running more than just a criminal enterprise. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, he created compromise opportunities, rooms, situations, photographs, conversations, access. And Trump walked through those rooms. One of the most striking intelligence notes I ever read about Epstein described him as an asset, witting or unwitting. Witting means he knew what he was doing. Unwitting means he didn't. Either way, the effect is the same. Information flows. Secrets get collected. Vulnerabilities are exposed. When analysts saw Trump's repeated presence around Epstein during the years when Epstein was already under informal observation, It triggered the exact kind of flag intelligence agencies rely on to assess long-term risk. Trump wasn't just photographed with Epstein. He occupied the same rarefied social spaces that foreign services monitor for precisely this reason. Let me paint another picture for you, something that stayed with me. I sat with a former CIA officer, someone who'd spent a large part of his career running assets in Europe. He told me, "Sir, the public thinks compromise means someone held a gun to your head. That's not how it works. Compromise is exposure. Compromise is not knowing who saw you, who was watching, who kept a record. Compromise is walking into the wrong room and assuming no one noticed." Then he added, "Power amplifies risk. Fame magnifies it. But ego is the accelerant." That sentence explained Trump in a way I had never fully understood until then. Here's what really scared me as I began reviewing all these reports. The intelligence community didn't have a full picture of the Trump-Epstein connection. They had fragments. They had timelines. They had overlapping data points. But they didn't have the completed puzzle, because Epstein's plea deal, his connections, and his death all ensured that too many pieces were either destroyed, sealed, or scattered. And from an intelligence perspective, an incomplete puzzle is more dangerous than a completed one. Because you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what evidence Epstein kept. You don't know what Maxwell witnessed. You don't know what foreign agencies might have collected quietly on the sidelines. Let me paint you one last moment. I remember reviewing a classified chart, a kind of risk web showing the network surrounding Epstein. It included names, dates, relationships, access points. Trump's circle was not the largest node, but it was there, intersecting with others, touching lines that stretched into places no president should ever be connected to, not even accidentally. And as I stared at that chart, one thought kept echoing in my mind. If the public ever saw what intelligence analysts saw, they would never again treat this story as a tabloid footnote. Because from the vantage point of national security, Trump's Epstein-Ties weren't just ugly. They were a vulnerability, a liability, a gap in the armor of the presidency. There's a moment in every investigation, whether you're dealing with organized crime, corruption, or trafficking, when the human cost becomes impossible to ignore. When the data points stop being abstract. When names stop being just entries in a file. When the stories you read stop being cases and start being people. And in the Epstein saga, that moment always comes the same way, through the voices of the victims. Let me walk you through a version of this chapter that is painful but necessary, because without understanding the human toll, you can't understand the full gravity of Trump's proximity to Epstein's world. A few years into my presidency, I asked for a briefing not just on Epstein's legal history, but on the survivors themselves, the girls who were groomed, trafficked, exploited, and silenced. I didn't want sanitized summaries. I wanted the raw accounts, the interviews, the affidavits, the sealed statements prosecutors had gathered long before Epstein was ever a household name. What I received wasn't a binder of evidence. It was a weight, a heaviness that settled over the room as page after page painted a portrait of systemic rot. Let me paint you a picture. I remember sitting with a senior DOJ attorney who had spent years talking to young women who were pulled into Epstein's orbit. She told me something I'll never forget. Most of these girls didn't know they were victims until years later. They thought they were lucky. Lucky to get noticed. Lucky to get invited somewhere nicer than where they came from. Lucky that powerful adults treated them as if they mattered, right up until they didn't. That's the psychological machinery predators rely on. Not force. Not fear. Seduction. Validation. Grooming. Step by step, inch by inch, until the boundary between innocence and exploitation dissolves. And many of those stories, not all but many, took place in environments where Trump's presence was documented. Not because he assaulted anyone, but because he was part of the same social ecosystem. He was in the same rooms, the same clubs, the same parties, sometimes the same houses. And when victims described the men who hovered in Epstein's world, their descriptions weren't always names, but they were recognizable. Let me be careful and precise here, because the facts deserve clarity. Some victims described older men watching Epstein's interactions with young girls. Some described VIP guests arriving unexpectedly. Some described being told to be friendly with certain male visitors. Some described being encouraged to impress wealthy men connected to Epstein's network. And in more than one account, sealed for years, then partially summarized for internal review. The descriptions matched individuals in Trump's orbit. Not always Trump himself, but his circle, his friends, his associates, his properties. One attorney who represented multiple survivors told me privately, the girls didn't always know who they were looking at. They just knew they were in the presence of men who made Epstein behave differently. Men who mattered. And here's where this becomes relevant to the larger story. When intelligence agencies evaluate vulnerability, they are not looking for guilt. They are looking for exposure. They're looking for situations where a powerful man could be compromised by what he saw, what he heard, what he ignored, or what he failed to report. If a man was present in an environment where crimes occurred, even if he didn't participate, that presence can be used against him. And Trump was present. Not always. Not everywhere. But enough. Let me paint you another picture, a more personal one. After reviewing some of the internal summaries of victim accounts, I felt something shift in me. Something heavy. I closed the folder and sat in silence for several minutes. In that moment, the political noise evaporated. The talking points, the scandals, the headlines, none of it mattered. What mattered were the girls who had been exploited in plain sight while powerful men mingled around them, pretending not to notice. What mattered were the missed chances. The adults who looked away. The institutions that failed. The billionaires who protected one another under the guise of social clubs and philanthropic circles. And what terrified me most was this. The victims' stories didn't just outline Epstein's crimes. They outlined the environment that allowed those crimes to flourish. And Donald Trump, as a public figure, as a social elite, as an owner of properties where recruitment occurred, was part of that environment. Let me be clear again. No victim in these cases ever provided a statement that proved Trump assaulted them. That distinction matters. But several accounts, when viewed through the lens of intelligence analysis, placed him near enough to the pipeline to create risk. Risk for the victims. Risk for the investigators. Risk for the country. And that's why their stories matter in this narrative. Because the human suffering Epstein caused wasn't isolated. It didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a world Trump helped legitimize through his presence, his status, and his silence. Here's what really scares me. When the survivors spoke about the men around Epstein, they often used the same phrase. They acted like nothing was wrong. And when someone with enormous power acts like nothing is wrong, it becomes easier for everyone else to follow their lead. That's the cost of silence. That's the cost of proximity. That's the cost of influence. And understanding that cost is what prepares us for the next chapter. The moment Epstein's 2019 arrest cracked open the entire architecture of secrecy that had protected Trump and so many others for decades. Epstein's 2019 arrest didn't feel like a news event. It felt like a rupture, a pressure point that had been building for decades suddenly tearing open all at once. And I remember exactly where I was when I got the first secure call about it. Not the public headline, not the sensational cable news version, but the internal alert that flashes through the intelligence system when something significant shifts on the national security radar. Let me walk you through that moment, because it matters more than most people realize. The call came late in the evening. I was sitting at home reading when the encrypted line flashed. On the other end, an intelligence liaison said in a steady voice, "Sir, Epstein has been taken into federal custody." The Southern District reopened the case. That sentence hit with the weight of a meteor. Not because Epstein was back in handcuffs, but because of what that implied. Old files would be reopened. Old sealed testimonies re-examined. Old patterns reanalyzed. Old names resurfacing. One of those names was Trump's. Let me paint you a picture of what happened inside the government during the 48 hours after Epstein's arrest. Agents who had spent years frustrated by the 2008 plea deal returned to old boxes. Analysts who'd been told to move on suddenly had permission to revisit timelines that had been frozen for over a decade. Internal databases lit up with cross-references, and one phrase started appearing repeatedly in confidential summaries. Review associations with known high-value individuals. You don't need to be a lawyer to know what that means. It means they were going back to the beginning, looking at everyone who'd been close to Epstein during the years when the trafficking operation was most active. Not just the men accused directly, but the ones whose presence raised questions. The ones who had been insulated by the earlier plea deal. The ones who existed in the shadows of those early investigations but never fully entered the frame. Trump wasn't the only one, but he was one of them. I remember one analyst telling me, when Epstein went down in 2019, it reopened every line we weren't allowed to follow in 2008. She said it calmly, but the meaning was explosive. The world was about to see what had been hidden. Let me walk you through what those reopened lines looked like. When Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport, agents seized documents, photographs, hard drives, material that wasn't part of the 2008 case. They reviewed flight logs that had been dismissed as incomplete. They pulled travel histories. They requested sealed civil filings that had been held under court protection for years. And although much of what they found never became public, internally, the effect was seismic. Because Trump's interactions with Epstein, once dismissed as casual social overlap, now had to be examined in the context of trafficking activity that was far more extensive than anyone admitted in 2008. Let me be clear, Trump was not charged. He was not named as a target of the investigation. But the FBI did what any responsible agency would do. They retraced the timelines. They cross-checked the parties, the guest list, the social events. They re-examined every point of contact. And behind closed doors, investigators were asking a question that still haunts me. What did Epstein know about the powerful men in his orbit, and who had the most to lose? That question wasn't political. It wasn't ideological. It was procedural. Anytime a major criminal network collapses, the first task is understanding the ecosystem. Epstein's ecosystem was filled with powerful men. Trump was one of the most powerful at that point, the sitting president of the United States. Let me paint you a moment that crystallized this. A senior counterintelligence official once told me, "Sir, when a man like Epstein is arrested, every intelligence service in the world starts asking what leverage he might have had and over whom." In other words, Epstein's arrest didn't just open investigations in the United States. It triggered interest abroad. Russian intelligence, Chinese intelligence, Israeli intelligence, British intelligence, all studying the same question: who did Epstein compromise, intentionally or not? And Trump, now president, was at the center of every one of those risk models. Here's what really scared me. As old interviews resurfaced, as staff testimonies were reviewed, as data logs were analyzed, something became unmistakably clear. The Trump-Epstein connection wasn't a footnote in Epstein's life. It was a thread woven through multiple years, early, middle, and late, of Epstein's recruitment pipeline. Not proof of guilt, not evidence of assault, but evidence of presence, evidence of proximity, evidence of opportunity for leverage. And that's the part most Americans never saw. Because the moment the truth seemed on the verge of breaking open, the moment Epstein became fully vulnerable, he died. Let me paint you one last picture. I will never forget the sinking feeling when the news came in. Epstein was dead in his cell. A man who could have exposed one of the most powerful blackmail networks in modern history was suddenly gone. And with him, gone were answers, not just about his crimes, but about the men who had moved through his world, including Donald Trump. Epstein's arrest reopened the questions. Epstein's death ensured many of them would never be fully answered. And what happened next, when Maxwell was finally taken into custody, would expose even more of the architecture that had protected Trump and others for decades. When Epstein died in that Manhattan cell, the world's attention snapped to Ghislaine Maxwell, the woman who had been hovering at the edge of the narrative for decades, the quiet architect of his operation, the gatekeeper, the scout, the social bridge. And I'll tell you something I've learned about power. Sometimes the most dangerous person in a room isn't the one everyone is staring at. It's the one standing just behind him, holding the invitation list. Let me walk you through how Maxwell fits into this story, and how her role deepens the understanding of Trump's proximity to Epstein's world. I remember the day Maxwell was arrested. Not the public spectacle, not the headlines about the FBI catching her in a secluded New Hampshire mansion, but the moment I received an internal assessment summarizing her importance. The analysts didn't mince words. Maxwell is the operational center of gravity. That phrase stuck with me. It meant she wasn't an accessory. She wasn't a bystander. She was the connective tissue, the person who made Epstein's network possible. Let me paint you a picture of how she operated. Maxwell wasn't just organizing parties or arranging travel. She was building relationships. She was curating rooms. She was identifying young women whose vulnerabilities could be exploited. And she was forging connections between Epstein and powerful men who, knowingly or unknowingly, validated his status by simply being present. Presidents, executives, royals, billionaires. She brought them together like pieces on a chessboard. And among those elite circles, Trump didn't appear as an outsider. He appeared as part of the furniture. The public saw the photos, Trump with Maxwell and Epstein at Mar-a-Lago. The smiles. The casual arm placements. The effortless familiarity of old social acquaintances. But the photos only tell a fraction of the truth. In internal accounts compiled by investigators and intelligence analysts, Maxwell's presence alongside Trump wasn't incidental. It was recurring. It reflected a deeper overlap in social ecosystems, parties, fundraisers, charity events, private gatherings in Manhattan and Palm Beach. One former intelligence liaison said it to me plainly: Maxwell was the access point, and the men she moved around were part of her currency. The access point. Think about that phrase for a moment. In intelligence work, access is everything. Access determines who gets invited, who gets vetted, who gets quietly observed, who gets remembered, and who gets whispered about in rooms without cameras. Maxwell wasn't just Epstein's partner. She was the one who made introductions, who normalized his presence in elite circles, who gave legitimacy to someone who, on his own, would have seemed suspicious. And that's where Trump's name begins appearing in ways that matter. Let me walk you through a detail that stuck with me. During the review of civil case files years after Epstein's first arrest, analysts found multiple references to Maxwell attending events at Trump's properties, some before the fallout between Trump and Epstein, some even after. Staff at Mar-a-Lago recognized her. Socialites recognized her. In one internal interview, a former club employee described Maxwell as a regular face at events where important people wanted to be seen. And here's the part most Americans never understood. Maxwell didn't attach herself to random men. She attached herself to influential men. Men with reputations. Men whose presence elevated Epstein's status and expanded his opportunities. Men who made Epstein look like he belonged in rooms he had no business being in. Trump was one of those men. Let me paint you another picture, this one based on an internal investigative summary I reviewed. A former Epstein associate described Maxwell as the social engineer. She knew which men needed flattery, which ones needed invitations, which ones needed access to feel important, which ones would defend Epstein because they enjoyed the benefits of proximity, the glamour, the models, the prestige. And she curated environments where Epstein's crimes could be concealed within the broader blur of wealthy excess. In those environments, Trump was not an anomaly. He was exactly the kind of man Maxwell targeted for influence. Here's what really scared me as I dug deeper into those reports. When Maxwell was finally arrested and her testimony became a possibility, intelligence agencies around the world braced themselves. Not because of what she might say about Epstein, but because of what she might say about the powerful men who circled him. The relationships, the gatherings, the protected spaces, the private moments that might have been recorded, the leverage she might still hold. I remember hearing an intelligence officer say, if Maxwell talks, half the room will pretend they've never met her, and the other half will go silent. It was a joke. But it wasn't. And Trump? He chose silence. Not denial. Not outrage. Silence. A silence that rang louder because it followed years of casual familiarity, mutual socializing, comments that once came easily to him when speaking about Epstein and Maxwell. Silence is a strategy in intelligence work. It signals fear. It signals calculation. Or it signals a man who doesn't know which parts of the story might resurface, or who might reveal them. Let me paint one final scene before we move on. Shortly after Maxwell's arrest, I was shown a confidential report analyzing her potential cooperation. The document didn't list names, but it listed categories: businessmen, media figures, political figures, global elites. Maxwell's interactions with these groups were labeled high-value social nodes. Trump's node, based on public and internal data, sat squarely within the overlap between social access and political vulnerability. He wasn't the centerpiece. He wasn't irrelevant. He was part of the network, one thread in a larger, darker tapestry. There's a point in any long investigation where the scattered pieces stop feeling random. When the dots, the ones that look disconnected for years, suddenly lock into place. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly, almost reluctantly, like your mind resisting a truth it doesn't want to accept. But once the pattern forms, you can't unsee it. And with Epstein, with Maxwell, with Trump hovering in the periphery of all of it, that moment came with unnerving clarity. Let me walk you through the pattern. Not the tabloid version, not the internet rumor mill, but the pattern as it appeared in intelligence briefs, law enforcement notes, classified summaries, and whispered conversations from people who'd spent their lives studying how exploitation networks operate. Start in the 1990s. Trump and Epstein attend the same parties. They vacation in the same social circles. They appear in each other's homes, each other's clubs, each other's photographs. Epstein recruits girls from the very spaces Trump owns, Mar-a-Lago specifically, through Maxwell's scouting. Trump jokes publicly about Epstein liking girls on the younger side. At the time, it all feels like rich man eccentricity. But in hindsight, it's the foundation of the pattern. Move into the early 2000s. Epstein's activities become more brazen. Maxwell's role becomes more defined. The recruitment pipeline expands. Social events grow smaller, more curated. Guest lists become more selective. And who's on those lists? People who provided Epstein with legitimacy. People whose presence acted as a shield. People whose approval signaled to others that Epstein was safe, normal, part of the club. Trump wasn't the only one, but he was consistently among them. Then the Mar-a-Lago incident happens. Epstein crosses a line on Trump's turf. The relationship fractures, not over morality, but over access, control, status. Investigators later circle this moment because it reveals something structural. Predators don't break ties because one suddenly discovers ethics. They break ties when interests collide. The rupture isn't exoneration. It's evidence of proximity. Now step into 2008. The plea deal silences everything. Plug is pulled. Witnesses are sidelined. Names of co-conspirators disappear into sealed documents. No one is investigated except Epstein. Not Maxwell. Not the men around him. Not the ones whose proximity created the environment he thrived in. The system shields not just Epstein, but the entire ecosystem. And who benefits? Every man whose presence in Epstein's world was too uncomfortably close to exposure. Trump included. Fast forward to 2019. Epstein is arrested again. The ecosystem trembles. Files reopen. Timelines reassembled. Analysts piece together who was where and when. They highlight overlaps between Epstein's recruitment spikes and specific social events, properties, and individuals. Trump's name appears not because investigators are hunting it, but because it's woven into the map. Then Epstein dies. And suddenly, everything freezes again. The pattern remains half exposed, half buried, half understood. The puzzle is there, but several pieces are missing, pieces only Epstein or Maxwell could fully supply. Then Maxwell is arrested. And in the internal analysis, the one the public never sees, she's described as a central organizing node, the person who connected men like Trump to Epstein's world more seamlessly than any other individual in the network. Let me paint you a picture of what the pattern looks like when you zoom out far enough. Step 1. Epstein establishes access to wealthy, influential men. Step 2. Maxwell legitimizes his presence in elite circles. Step 3. Young girls are recruited through environments those men frequent. Step 4. Social proximity provides Epstein cover. Powerful men create social camouflage. Step 5. Conflicts between powerful men reveal internal competition, not moral boundaries. Step 6. Legal systems fail, shielding the entire ecosystem. Step 7. When the system finally wakes up, Epstein disappears and Maxwell becomes the failsafe. Now imagine placing Trump's name along that sequence. Not as the puppet master, not as the center of the design, but as one of the men whose proximity supports the ecosystem at multiple points. That's the part that changes everything. Because from the intelligence perspective, patterns aren't about proving guilt. Patterns are about identifying risk. And the Trump-Epstein pattern reveals multiple layers of vulnerability. Proximity to environments compromised by exploitation. Repeated presence around individuals associated with trafficking. Interactions mediated by Maxwell, an operational architect. Discontinuities in the public narrative that don't match internal data. Fractures that signal internal conflict, not moral opposition. Insulation provided by the 2008 plea deal. Renewed exposure during the 2019 arrest. Renewed silence after Epstein's death. Here's what really scares me, and what scared the investigators who watched this unfold. Every layer of the pattern suggests a president who carried hidden liabilities that foreign intelligence services analyze the way archaeologists study ruins. It's not about whether Trump assaulted someone. It's about whether someone could prove he was present, or that he knew something, or that he ignored something, or that he benefited from something, or that he feared something being revealed. Compromise isn't about guilt. It's about leverage. And once you see the Trump-Epstein pattern through that lens, the intelligence lens, the vulnerability lens, you realize it's not a scandal. It's a risk profile. A risk profile with implications far beyond one man's reputation. And that's why the next chapter focuses on what this means not just for Trump, but for America's security, our democracy, and the fragility of a system that depends on leaders without hidden shadows trailing behind them. If you've been following closely up to this point, you've probably felt the slow tightening, that sensation that the Trump-Epstein connection isn't just a moral stain or a social embarrassment, but something far heavier, something structural, something that reaches into the machinery of American power. And if there's one thing I learned in the Oval Office, it's this: personal vulnerabilities don't stay personal when you're the president. They become national vulnerabilities. They become geopolitical openings. They become leverage points for adversaries who study your weaknesses the way surgeons study anatomy. Let me walk you through what this means for America's security, not in partisan terms, not in emotional terms, but in the cold, clinical language of national risk. When intelligence agencies evaluate a president, they don't just assess policy positions or alliances. They assess exposure. They analyze the person, not just the office. They run background models, psychological, behavioral, financial, relational. They ask questions like, has this individual ever been in a situation that someone else could weaponize? Is there material, photos, documents, testimony, witness accounts that could be used to pressure them? Has this person been in proximity to environments that create compromise risk? And with Trump, the answer to all three was yes. Not because he committed Epstein's crimes, but because he was present in rooms where those crimes occurred. Because he interacted socially with the architects of those crimes. Because he existed inside an environment foreign intelligence agencies would naturally target. Let me paint you a picture from inside a counterintelligence briefing. Picture a dim, windowless room. Analysts sitting around a table. A screen showing a risk web, names, dates, relationships, vulnerabilities. You see Epstein's name on the left. Maxwell's on the right. A cluster of powerful men in the center. Among them, Trump. The analyst speaks in a calm, measured tone, the kind that tells you emotion has been scrubbed from the equation. Sir, exposure of this type creates openings for foreign influence. Possibility of compromise cannot be excluded. Patterns consistent with historical exploitation. That phrase, historical exploitation, should send a chill down anyone's spine. Because it means this isn't hypothetical. It's precedent. Let me paint you an example of that precedent. During the Cold War, Soviet intelligence targeted wealthy American businessmen and visiting dignitaries by placing them in compromised environments. Not to blackmail them publicly, that wasn't the point. The point was subtle influence. A phone call returned more quickly than usual. A business deal suddenly approved. A political statement softened. A favor granted. Leverage doesn't look like a threat. It looks like a whisper. Epstein's network, intentionally or not, created exactly that kind of environment. A breeding ground for compromise. A place where powerful men let their guard down, where cameras might have been present, where staff might have been listening, where witnesses might now be cooperating with investigators. Trump was in those environments. One former CIA operations officer, someone who had handled cases involving foreign blackmail, put it to me bluntly, "Sir, it's not about what Trump did. It's about what someone else may know he did, or didn't stop or didn't question." Think about that. A president whose first instinct is denial. A president who values image above substance. A president who lashes out when confronted with personal vulnerability. A president whose inner circle includes individuals with their own exposure risks. Now place that man across the table from Vladimir Putin, or Xi Jinping, or Mohammed bin Salman, or Netanyahu. or any leader who understands the value of secrets and the cost of exposure. Here's what really scares me. Foreign intelligence agencies likely studied Trump's relationship with Epstein more thoroughly than most Americans ever did. They had access to informants, to surveillance, to intercepted communications, to intelligence exchanges with partners who had tracked Epstein for years. They would have built psychological profiles around the vulnerabilities Epstein represented. And they would have asked one question: how can this be used? Let me paint you a scene that never happened publicly, but almost certainly happened behind closed doors in foreign capitals. Analysts gather around a table. They pull up a digital file with Trump's known social history, his associations, his documented interactions with Epstein. They outline potential pressure points. They evaluate whether approaching him directly would be too risky. They map the most effective ways to influence someone who fears humiliation more than anything else. You don't need explicit evidence of wrongdoing to compromise a man like that. You need suggestion. You need implication. You need the possibility of exposure. And the possibility alone can be enough to tilt decisions that affect millions of lives. Let me give you one final example, something an NSA veteran told me over coffee long after I left office. He said, "A president doesn't need to be guilty to be compromised. He only needs to be uncertain about what someone else can reveal." That sentence should be carved into the walls of every intelligence training facility. Because Trump's long, messy, poorly understood proximity to Epstein didn't just endanger his reputation. It endangered America's leverage. It endangered negotiations. It endangered alliances. It endangered our ability to trust the decisions coming from the Oval Office. When a president carries unresolved exposure, the entire country carries it with him. And that's why the next chapter matters, because it shows how fast everything can spiral if a man with that kind of vulnerability finds himself facing a crisis where every second, every decision, every whisper could become a turning point for the fate of the nation. There's a test that every president eventually faces, a moment when the weight of the office compresses into seconds. Not minutes, not hours, seconds. The kind of moment where one misjudgment, one hesitation, one compromised instinct can ripple across continents. And if you want to understand the full danger of Trump's proximity to Epstein, you have to imagine what happens when a president with unresolved vulnerabilities is placed inside one of those tight, unforgiving moments. Let me walk you through it. Not as fiction, not as a thriller, but as a scenario pulled directly from the kinds of crisis simulations real presidents undergo. Imagine it's 2:03 a.m. A duty officer shakes you awake. You're told to report immediately. The military aides are already waiting. You walk into the situation room still half-wired from sleep, and the air feels electrically charged. The briefing begins. Words like satellite intercept, hostile action, escalation window, retaliatory posture get thrown around. You're handed a folder stamped with red markings. Inside a threat. A real one. Something that could kill people. Something that could destabilize a region. Something that demands clarity. And imagine, in that exact moment, you are Donald Trump. A man whose life left long shadows. A man who has never fully known what Epstein had on him, or what Maxwell recorded, or what foreign intelligence services collected quietly over the years. Now imagine this. Just as the briefing reaches its climax, a national security aide leans forward and says, "Sir, there is an additional consideration." He explains that a foreign head of state, maybe Russia's, maybe Saudi Arabia's, maybe another leader with a talent for exploiting insecurities, has unexpectedly requested a private call right now. They say it's urgent. They say it's related. They say they can de-escalate the situation, but only if they speak to the president directly. Most Americans don't realize how common this tactic is. Foreign adversaries exploit chaos. They create pressure. They make you vulnerable, not militarily, but psychologically. Now imagine being Trump in that moment. Imagine knowing that this leader, this foreign adversary, may have access to information you desperately hope never becomes public. A photo, a witness account, a flight record, a piece of surveillance, a rumor they know you fear, something they can dangle without ever showing their hand. Let me paint you that picture more clearly. On one side of the table, your generals urging caution, urging measured escalation. On the other side, your political instincts telling you to protect your image, your brand, your ego. And hovering over it all, The quiet fear that someone, somewhere, could pull a thread tied directly to Jeffrey Epstein. What decision do you make in that moment? Which instinct wins? Which fear speaks louder? Here's the part that should keep every American up at night. Compromised leaders don't always realize they're compromised. They rationalize. They tell themselves they're choosing diplomacy. They convince themselves they're avoiding disaster. But the truth is simpler. They're avoiding humiliation. They're avoiding exposure. They're avoiding the one thing they've spent their whole lives outrunning. Let me walk you through an example that mirrors real crisis models. Imagine an adversary fires a missile that lands just shy of a U.S. military base. No casualties, but a message. Intelligence recommends a firm response. The Pentagon outlines 3 options: a proportional strike, a cyber disruption, or a defensive posture with a diplomatic warning. But then that same adversary signals through back channels they want a favor, not publicly, not explicitly, just a softening of rhetoric, a withdrawal of sanctions, a promise not to retaliate, and implicitly, never stated but understood, a fear they could leverage something unspoken. Now picture Trump in that chair. A man who reacts instinctively to threat. A man who makes decisions based on personal calculations, not national ones. A man who has a long social history filled with shadows he refuses to acknowledge. Do you see the danger now? Let me paint one last scenario, one that intelligence officials used more than once during training. Imagine a nuclear stand-down decision. You have 5 minutes to choose. 5. And in that window, a foreign leader suggests they know things. They hint at information. They mention a year, place, a name, or maybe just a phrase. We understand your situation. For a man with no vulnerabilities, it's a hollow threat. For a man with a lifetime of unresolved exposure, social, financial, personal, it's a psychological chokehold. Here's what really scares me. The presidency is built on the assumption that the person holding the nuclear codes cannot be pressured by secrets, that their decisions are sovereign, not shaped by fear, that they cannot be blackmailed, not even implicitly. America's safety depends on that assumption. But with Trump, the Epstein connection made that assumption impossible. This isn't about what he did. It's about what someone else could exploit. It's about how a predator's network becomes a president's weakness. It's about how a private shadow becomes a national fault line. And that brings us to the final chapter, the choice we face as a country now that we can finally see the pattern clearly. The warning, the hinge point in our history. There's a moment after you lay out a story like this, the patterns, the proximity, the intelligence concerns, the human cost, when you have to step back and ask the only question that really matters. So what do we do with this knowledge? Because a democracy doesn't survive on outrage alone. It survives on recognition, on clarity, on the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths before they calcify into national weaknesses. Let me walk you through the choice now facing this country, because it's not theoretical. It's not historical. It's not partisan. It's moral, structural, existential. Imagine standing on a ridge overlooking the last decade of American life. Below you is a tangled landscape of scandals, lies, secrecy, corruption, exploitation, disinformation, and political violence. You see the outlines now, the networks, the alliances, the cover-ups, the whispers that you once dismissed as noise. And somewhere in that landscape is the Trump-Epstein connection, not as a standalone scandal, but as a symbol of a deeper sickness, a culture where power shields itself while the vulnerable are fed into the machinery. The truth is simple and brutal. A democracy cannot survive if its leaders carry secrets that other people can weaponize. We can tolerate flaws. We can tolerate disagreements. But we cannot tolerate vulnerabilities welded directly onto the office meant to defend us. Let me paint you a picture of the fork in the road. On the left, there is denial. A path paved with excuses, false equivalences, partisan reflexes. A path where people shrug and say, "Who cares? It was years ago." Or "This is just politics," or "Everyone has skeletons." That path leads somewhere very dark, a place where every future leader learns that accountability is optional, that proximity to predators can be spun into nothingness, that the presidency can be carried like a trophy instead of a responsibility. On that path, America drifts toward becoming the kind of country where leverage, rules, and truth becomes a disposable inconvenience. Now look to the right. There is clarity. A path where we finally admit what intelligence professionals have known for years, that personal shadows become national shadows. That private exposure becomes public risk. That a man who traveled through Epstein's world, even unknowingly, even peripherally, carries vulnerabilities no democracy can afford in its commander-in-chief. On this path, we acknowledge the warning embedded in the Trump-Epstein story. The United States cannot sustain leaders who treat power as a shield rather than an obligation. We cannot keep gambling our national security on the belief that a man can outrun his past forever. We cannot continue pretending that compromise is an abstract threat. It's not. Compromise is real. It's quiet. It's patient. And it thrives in the spaces where silence festers. Here's what really scares me, and it's the reason I'm telling this story now. If we don't confront this pattern, if we don't demand transparency and accountability from the people who seek power, then the next man who carries a hidden vulnerability may face a crisis moment far worse than any we've seen. And when that moment comes, when a foreign adversary whispers into the ear of a compromised president, the consequences will not be limited to political embarrassment. They will be measured in lives, in freedoms, in the trajectory of this nation. Let me leave you with one more picture, the clearest I can offer. Imagine a president walking alone down the hallway that leads to the Oval Office, the weight of a decision hanging around his neck. The world is watching. The country is depending on him. But behind him, invisible to the public, is a shadow he never resolved. A memory, a secret, a room he wishes he'd never walked into. And somewhere, someone else holds that memory more tightly than he does. That's the danger. That's the warning. That's the hinge point. We face a choice now, not just about Trump, not just about Epstein, but about what kind of country we want to be. A nation held hostage by the shadows its leaders drag behind them? Or a nation that demands leaders who stand in the light, unafraid, unexposed, accountable? Because in the end, democracies don't collapse from a single blow. They collapse from 1,000 unspoken secrets. And the hardest truth of all is this. What we refuse to confront will eventually control us. This is an imagined political thriller story, not a real classified leak or inside intelligence.